She was 44 years old, and by the first frost of that autumn she had nothing left to her name but a tin trunk, a wool shawl gone thin at the elbows, and $11 folded into a handkerchief. Her husband's brother, Silas Calloway, had stood on the porch of the farm she had helped build with her own 2 hands and told her, without meeting her eyes, that the land was his now, that the debts were his to settle, and that a widow with no sons had no claim the county would honor. So she walked, with her orphan niece Etta at her side, into the town of Ashwater Valley, carrying only what she could not bear to leave behind. When the county auctioned off a ruined old waystation at the valley's edge, a crumbling stone and timber husk nobody had set foot in for 90 years, its roof caved, its name half forgotten, she paid $4 for it, and the men at the auction laughed behind their hands at the foolish widow buying a pile of stones. She told herself it was shelter, nothing more. She did not know yet that sealed inside those old walls was a secret that would clear a dead man's name, feed a starving valley's memory of itself, and change everything Ashwater believed about its own history. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, left behind by the world the way that old waystation was left behind by time, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you are joining us from tonight. Ruth Calloway had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been born Ruth Ann Prescott in 1861 in a cabin at the northern lip of Ashwater Valley, the second of 5 children to a blacksmith father and a mother who kept bees and read scripture aloud in the evenings by tallow light. The valley itself sat cupped in the shoulders of the Colorado high country, a green seam of grazing land and creek-fed soil that had drawn settlers up from the Front Range as early as 1813, when a Virginia-born trader named Nathaniel Pruitt led the first wagons in and declared the place fit for a town. Ruth grew up on stories of that founding generation the way other children grew up on fairy tales, stories of hard winters survived, of neighbors who shared their last sack of flour, of a valley that had clawed its way into being through sheer stubborn will. Her father used to say that Ashwater was built twice, once by the men who first drove their wagons over Cold Iron Pass, and once again by the ones who stayed after the valley nearly broke them. What he meant by that, Ruth would not fully understand until she was a grown woman herself, but she absorbed from him something that mattered more than the history. She absorbed his hands. Her father, Thaddeus Prescott, ran the only forge for 30 miles, and from the time she was old enough to work a bellows, Ruth spent her afternoons at his elbow, learning the particular alchemy of fire and iron, learning to read metal the way other girls learned to read lace patterns. She learned, too, the deeper lesson underneath the craft, that broken things were rarely worthless things. A cracked plow blade was not garbage to Thaddeus Prescott. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved, iron waiting to remember what shape it wanted to be. He would turn a bent horseshoe over in his palm for a long moment before he ever threw it in the scrap bin, and more often than not he found a use for it after all. Ruth used to tease him that he could not bear to let anything go, and he would only smile and tell her that a thing being cheap did not mean a thing being worthless, and that the 2 words got confused by people too impatient to look closely. She carried that lesson with her the way other women carried a locket. When she married Thomas Calloway in 1882, a steady, soft-spoken man who ran cattle on leased range at the southern end of the valley, she brought to their marriage not a dowry of silver but a dowry of patience, the patience to mend a fence 12 times before admitting it needed replacing, to nurse a sick calf through a week of sleepless nights rather than write it off, to darn and redarn a coat until the thread itself seemed woven from stubbornness. Thomas used to say that his wife could find the good in a drought if you gave her long enough to look. They never had children of their own, a private sorrow they folded quietly into the rhythm of their life together, but when Thomas's younger brother Silas and his wife died within a year of each other, Silas's wife of childbed fever, and then, 3 years later, that same brother's first wife's sister, who had been raising the child, of a wasting sickness, it was Ruth who took in the little girl left behind. A solemn 6-year-old named Etta who did not speak above a whisper for the better part of a year. Ruth raised her as her own, teaching her the same things her father had taught her, that patience was a kind of wealth, that nothing broken was necessarily finished, and that the measure of a person was what she did when she had every reason to give up. For 18 years, the Calloway Ranch prospered in a modest, unglamorous way, the kind of prosperity built on early mornings and careful accounting rather than luck. Thomas expanded the herd slowly. Ruth kept the books, tended a garden that was the envy of the valley, and became known, quietly, the way such reputations grow, as the woman neighbors sent for when something needed mending that seemed past mending. She fixed clocks. She reset dislocated shoulders. She could coax a stalled well pump back to life with nothing but patience and a length of wire. Etta grew up watching her aunt work this way, and grew, in turn, into a girl with the same unhurried competence, the same refusal to declare a thing finished before she had truly looked at it. It was in the spring of 1904 that the first crack appeared in the life Ruth had built. Thomas, riding out to check a fence line after a night of hard rain, was thrown from his horse in a gully that had washed out overnight, and though he lingered for 11 days, the injury to his back and the fever that followed proved more than his body could outlast. Ruth nursed him through every one of those 11 days without sleeping more than a handful of hours strung together, and when he died in the small hours of a June morning, she was left a widow at 43, with a ranch, a herd, a niece she loved as a daughter, and, as she would soon discover, a husband's estate more tangled than she had ever been permitted to know. Thomas, it turned out, had mortgaged a portion of the ranch 2 years earlier to cover a bad season, and the note had been held not by the bank in town but privately, by his own brother Silas, who had by then remarried and grown considerably more prosperous through a partnership with the valley's leading financier, a banker named Alden Marsh. Silas arrived at the ranch not 2 weeks after the funeral, dressed in a new coat Ruth had never seen before, and informed her, with a formality that felt rehearsed, that the note was due, that Ruth had no legal standing as a childless widow to contest the debt, and that he intended to call it in full. Ruth offered to work the debt down herself, to sell stock, to do anything that would let her keep even a corner of the home she had spent 18 years building. Silas would not hear of it. Ashwater's county customs, still shaped by an older generation's notions of inheritance, gave him every advantage, and Alden Marsh's bank, which held the paper on the note now that Silas had quietly sold his interest in it for a tidy sum, was not in the business of sentiment. By the end of August, Ruth Calloway and her niece Etta stood on the porch of the only home either of them had ever truly known, watching Silas's hired men drive the herd toward the road, and within a month they had sold or given away nearly everything that would not fit into a single tin trunk, and taken a room above the mercantile in town while Ruth tried to decide what a woman with no land and no husband and no sons was permitted to become in a place like Ashwater Valley. She took in mending. She sold eggs from a borrowed coop. She counted, and recounted, the $11 that stood between herself and Etta and the coming winter, and she tried very hard not to let the girls see her cry. It was in that state, proud, frightened, and unwilling to let either feeling show, that Ruth found herself, on a gray October afternoon, standing at the edge of a small crowd gathered for the county's annual tax lien auction, where properties too long abandoned or too long unpaid were sold off for whatever a buyer would offer. Most of the parcels went for a few dollars apiece, scrubland nobody wanted, but the last item on the auctioneer's list drew a ripple of amusement through the crowd, a half-collapsed stone waystation out past the old cold iron road, a building so old that even the county clerk seemed unsure of its history beyond a notation that read, simply, Journey's Rest, condemned 1817, unclaimed. Nobody bid. The auctioneer called for an offer twice, 3 times, and when Ruth, almost before she had decided to do it, raised her hand and said, $4, a few men actually laughed, and one called out that she'd bought herself a pile of rocks and a den of rattlesnakes. She paid the $4 anyway, folding the receipt into her handkerchief beside the $6 she had left, and told herself, walking back to town with Etta's hand in hers, that at least a roof was a roof, even a fallen one, and that a woman with nowhere else to go could not afford to be choosy about her shelter. The waystation sat nearly 2 miles from the town proper, at a bend in the old freight road where the land began to climb toward Cold Iron Pass, and when Ruth and Etta walked out to see what they had bought, the sight that greeted them was sobering even by the standards of a woman who had learned not to expect much. Half the roof had collapsed inward decades before, allowing 3/4 of a century of snow and rain to work its slow ruin on the floorboards beneath. Sagebrush grew up through a gap in the stone foundation. The great stone hearth at the building's center, though, had survived nearly whole, its chimney still standing, blackened with the smoke of fires that had gone cold sometime in the last century, and it was there that Ruth chose to make her first camp, clearing debris from around the hearthstones with hands that had not lost their calluses even in a year of gentler work. It took the better part of 2 weeks of patient labor, patching the roof with salvaged shingles bought on credit, sweeping out generations of dust, propping a fallen ceiling beam with a length of iron she forged herself over a fire built in that very hearth, before the waystation began to resemble something a person might live in rather than merely survive inside. It was during this work, on an evening when Ruth was examining the hearth itself for a crack she feared might let smoke back into the room, that her fingers found something odd along the inner edge of the firebox, a seam in the stone too straight, too deliberate, to be a natural fracture. She worked at it with the flat of a chisel for the better part of an hour before a section of the hearthstone, cut and fitted with a mason's care long before, came loose in her hands, revealing a narrow cavity behind it, dry as bone despite the decades of weather that had savaged everything around it, and inside that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, a small bundle of papers and a leather-bound journal whose cover had been tooled, long ago, with the initials J.C. Ruth carried the bundle to the one window with unbroken glass and unwrapped it with the same careful patience she gave to everything she did not yet understand, and what she found, in handwriting gone faint but still legible, was the private account of a man named Josiah Cobb, who had kept this very waystation as its master in the years when Ashwater Valley was still a settlement clinging to survival, and who had written, in the last entries of that journal, of a supply train, 9 wagons, loaded with seed grain, tools, bolts of wool, medicine, and a strong box of coin meant to see the valley through its second winter, that had set out from Fort Laramie in the last week of October, 1815, under a foreman named Talbot, bound for Ashwater over Cold Iron Pass, and had never arrived. Ruth sat with that journal until the light failed entirely, reading by the last of the fire, and what emerged from Josiah Cobb's careful, aching sentences was not simply the record of a disaster but the record of a man's ruin. The Talbot train, Cobb had written, was meant to be his crowning achievement as waystation master, the largest resupply Ashwater had ever attempted, financed jointly by the valley's founding families and organized, at every stage, under his direction. He had chosen the route himself, over Cold Iron Pass rather than the longer southern trail, believing the mountain route would beat the season's first heavy snow by a full week. He had written, in an entry dated 3 days before the train's scheduled departure, of his unease at how few armed drovers had been hired to accompany the wagons, far fewer than the numbers he had specified in his original plan and budget, and of his suspicion, never quite voiced aloud, that someone had trimmed the expedition's funding without his knowledge. When the train failed to arrive by the second week of November, and a search party sent up Cold Iron Pass turned back after 4 days in the face of an early, brutal blizzard, the valley's founding council had turned not to the missing foreman Talbot, who could not be questioned, but to Josiah Cobb, who could, and had, within a month, stripped him of his position, his good name, and very nearly his life, on the accusation that he had deliberately underfunded the guard and diverted a portion of the supplies for private profit, selling them off to a rival post before ever sending the wagons north. Cobb's last entries, written in a hand grown increasingly unsteady, insisted again and again on his innocence, insisted that the funding had been cut by someone above him, someone with access to the ledgers he had never been permitted to see in full, and begged whoever might one day read these pages to understand that he had not stolen from the valley that trusted him, that he had, instead, been made to answer for another man's theft. He died, the journal's final page noted in a different, later hand, Cobb's own son, it seemed, in the winter of 1817, not 2 years after the disaster, of what the boy called simply, a broken heart no doctor could mend, and was buried outside the valley's boundary, in unconsecrated ground, because the council of that era would not permit a thief's grave inside the town he had supposedly betrayed. Ruth read the journal 3 times that night, and by the third reading her hands were trembling for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. She understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have themselves been wrongly accused of failure, exactly what Josiah Cobb had been trying to say across 90 years of silence. But it was the last page of the bundle, not the journal itself, but a separate, carefully folded sheet, that made her sit up straight in the dark. It was a hand-drawn map, rendered with a surveyor's precision, marking a route up Cold Iron Pass and, at its terminus, a spot Cobb had labeled simply as, the shelf beneath Widow's Ridge, with a note beneath it, added, it seemed, sometime after the disaster, tea, reached the shelf. I am certain of it. The storm came too fast for the pass beyond. If the wagon stopped there, the overhang would have held. No one will look. No one believes me enough to look. It took Ruth the better part of a week to work up the courage to ask anyone in town about Josiah Cobb, and when she did, carefully, over the counter of the mercantile, framing it as idle curiosity about the old waystation's history, she found that the story had calcified into something closer to legend than fact. The old-timers who remembered their grandparents' accounts spoke of Cobb the thief as though the verdict had been handed down by scripture rather than by a frightened council in the depth of a terrible winter, and more than one person warned her, half joking and half serious, that she had bought herself a haunted building and ought to watch her step. Only one person in town, an elderly widow named Prudence Ostrander whose grandmother had lived through the hungry winter of 1815, offered Ruth anything like sympathy for the dead man, telling her quietly that her grandmother had always maintained Cobb was a decent, careful soul who would never have gambled with the valley's survival, and that the accusation had always seemed, to those who knew him, to arrive with unusual speed and unusual convenience for certain other men in the valleys. Founding council, men whose own ledgers, that terrible winter, were never quite so closely examined as Cobb's had been. Ruth did not sleep well after that conversation. She lay awake calculating, the way her father had taught her to calculate the true worth of a broken thing, and what she calculated frightened her a little, because the arithmetic pointed, again and again, toward a name she recognized, Ezra Marsh, listed in Cobb's own journal as the council member who had controlled the expedition's private funding, and grandfather, Ruth was fairly certain, of the very banker who now held the note on the ranch that had once been hers. She said nothing of this to anyone but Etta, not yet, because a suspicion 90 years old, resting on the word of a dead man nobody in town would defend, was not proof, and Ruth Calloway had learned the hard way what it cost a woman to make an accusation she could not fully back. What she could do, she decided, was look. If Josiah Cobb had been telling the truth, if the Talbot train truly had reached that stone shelf beneath Widow's Ridge before the storm swallowed it, then 90 years of dry, cold mountain air, sealed beneath an overhang that Cobb's own map insisted would have protected it, might have preserved more than anyone in Ashwater Valley had ever imagined possible. And if she was wrong, she told herself, she would have lost nothing but a few days walking in the high country, which was rather less than she had already lost that year. She told only Etta and Prudence Ostrander what she intended to do, and it was Prudence, in the end, who insisted on coming along, bringing with her a nephew named Caleb who knew the old trails better than any map, and it was the three of them, on a bright, cold morning in late October, almost exactly 90 years, Ruth realized with a shiver, since the Talbot train had first set out, who climbed the switchback trail up Cold Iron Pass toward the shoulder of stone that Cobb's map called Widow's Ridge. They found the shelf a little after midday, a long limestone overhang jutting from the mountainside where a rockslide, sometime in the intervening decades, had partially sealed its mouth with a wall of broken stone and drifted soil that had, over 90 years, grown a thin cover of grass and juniper, disguising it so completely that a person could have walked past it 100 times without suspecting what lay behind. It took Caleb and Ruth the better part of 3 hours, working with pick and shovel and bare, bleeding hands, to open a gap wide enough to pass through, and when Ruth finally crawled into the darkness beyond, holding a lantern with a hand that shook from more than cold, the light fell across the ribs and canvas covers of wagons that had not moved in 90 years, their wheels still sound, their canvas brittle but largely intact, arranged in a rough circle exactly as a careful foreman would have arranged them to wait out a storm he believed would pass. She would tell people, in the years afterward, that she wept before she ever opened a single crate, because the wagons themselves told the story plainly enough, 9 wagons, just as Cobb's journal had recorded, drawn up in the shelter Cobb had predicted, their teams long since gone but their cargo, protected from moisture by the dry stone and from scavengers by the sealed entrance, waiting in a silence that felt, Ruth said later, less like a tomb than like a held breath finally allowed to release. News of what Ruth Calloway had found up on Widow's Ridge reached town before she and Caleb and Prudence had even finished their descent, carried down by a rancher who had spotted their lanterns from the valley floor the night before and ridden ahead at first light to spread the word, and by the time Ruth walked back into Ashwater the following afternoon, half the town had gathered in the square, uncertain whether to believe the story or dismiss it as the fevered imagining of a woman everyone knew had lost nearly everything the previous year. Ruth did not raise her voice or defend herself against the murmurs of doubt. She simply produced Josiah Cobb's journal, and the map, and asked the county clerk, a careful, unhurried man named Otis Fenwick who had held his post for 30 years and had no particular loyalty to any family's version of history, to read the account aloud to whoever cared to listen, and to compare its details, point by point, against what she and Caleb and Prudence had found on the mountain. It was Alden Marsh who first tried to have the matter set aside. He arrived at the square that same afternoon, immaculate in a banker's dark coat, and argued, with the smooth confidence of a man used to being believed, that the journal of a man 90 years dead and long ago found guilty by a lawful counsel proved nothing at all, that Ruth Calloway's discovery, whatever it truly was, belonged by right of salvage to the county rather than to a woman who had bought a worthless ruin for $4. And that in any case the cargo, if any of it had survived at all, would surely be too rotted and ruined after 90 years to matter to anyone. He was, Ruth would come to understand, more frightened than he appeared, because Alden Marsh had grown up hearing his grandfather Ezra praised in careful, curated family stories as the valley's shrewd early financier, and he understood, faster than most in the square that day, exactly what a full accounting of the Talbot train's funding might reveal about the source of the Marsh family's earliest fortune. Alden did not stop at argument. Within days, he had used his position at the bank to call in the small debt Ruth had taken on to buy roofing shingles and nails for the waystation, a debt he had until then shown no urgency about collecting, and he let it be known, quietly, among the men whose business he controlled, that anyone who assisted the widow Calloway's expedition up Cold Iron Pass might find their own loans reviewed rather more closely than they were accustomed to. Caleb's own father, who ran the livery, was warned off lending Ruth mules for a second, larger expedition, and for nearly 2 weeks it seemed the whole of Ashwater's practical machinery, its money, its animals, its labor, had quietly closed itself against her, just as it had closed against Josiah Cobb 90 years before. It was Prudence Ostrander, in the end, who broke the silence, standing up at a town meeting called to discuss the Calloway matter, and reading aloud, in a voice that did not waver despite her 71 years, her own grandmother's private account of the winter of 1815, an account that had been kept, unread by anyone outside the family, in a family Bible for 90 years, and that named, in plain, unhesitating language, Ezra Marsh as the council member who had quietly reduced Josiah Cobb's requested funding for armed drovers by more than half, pocketing the difference through an arrangement with a supplier at Fort Laramie, and who had, when the train vanished, been the loudest and quickest voice calling for Cobb's disgrace. The room went very still. Otis Fenwick, the county clerk, confirmed that the surviving fragments of the original 1815 ledgers, incomplete, but not entirely lost, tucked away in the county archive that nobody had troubled to consult in decades, showed exactly the discrepancy Prudence's grandmother had described, a sum diverted in the weeks before the train's departure that matched, almost to the dollar, the difference between the guard Cobb had requested and the guard the train had actually received. Faced with a ledger, a journal, a map, and a wagon train sitting exactly where Josiah Cobb's own hand had said it would be, the town's doubt began, at last, to turn. Ruth did not ask for punishment for Alden Marsh, and would say later that she found no satisfaction in watching a man's face change color as his family's oldest, proudest story collapsed in front of his neighbors. What she asked for, standing before the same square that had once laughed at her for spending $4 on a ruin, was simple, that the county formally reopen and organize the recovery of the Talbot cargo, that whatever remained of it be used first to settle the debts of Ashwater families still struggling in the wake of 2 hard years, and that Josiah Cobb's name be formally cleared and his grave, still resting outside the town's boundary, be moved at last inside it, beside the wife and son, who had outlived his disgrace but never stopped believing him. In the days between the town meeting and the first shovel breaking ground at the shelf below Widow's Ridge, Ruth found herself, for the first time in more than a year, treated by her neighbors not as an object of pity or amusement but as someone worth consulting. Otis Fenwick rode out to the waystation twice to go over the old ledger fragments with her line by line, marveling aloud that a woman with no formal schooling in accounts could spot a discrepancy in a column of 90-year-old figures faster than he could himself, and Ruth only smiled and told him that numbers, like broken iron, told the truth to anyone patient enough to listen. Prudence Ostrander took to visiting most afternoons, bringing preserves and news and, once, a small framed photograph of her grandmother that she pressed into Ruth's hands, saying that the old woman would have wanted Ruth to have some proof, at least, that a promise kept 90 years could still matter to somebody. Even Caleb, quiet and steady, began stopping by most evenings after his work at the livery to help Ruth reinforce the waystation's roof properly before winter closed in, and Etta, who had spent the past year speaking mostly in the careful, guarded sentences of a child who had learned not to expect much from the world, began, for the first time since her aunt could remember, to laugh easily and often, chattering about the wheat seed and the old wagons and what she meant to plant come spring. The recovery took the better part of a month, with half the town turning out to help once the truth had settled over Ashwater like the first real snow of the season. What they found astonished even Ruth, who had allowed herself to hope but had not quite dared to expect so much. The seed grain, sealed in tin-lined crates exactly as period practice required for a long freight haul, had been kept so dry and so cold for 90 years that a portion of it, tested the following spring in Ruth's own garden plot, actually sprouted. Heirloom wheat and barley strains the valley had lost decades before, grown scarce and then forgotten as newer seed stock replaced them, sprouting green and stubborn out of ground that had waited 90 years for its return. The tools, plow blades, axe heads, a small forge's worth of iron stock, needed only cleaning and a careful retempering to be as serviceable as the day they were packed, and it was Ruth herself, remembering everything her father had taught her at his own forge, who oversaw that work. The bolts of wool cloth had fared less well, brittle and moth-touched despite their oilcloth wrapping, but even they yielded enough sound fabric to be of real use to families who had gone without new clothing longer than they cared to admit. And the strongbox, dented, its lock long rusted through, but its contents dry, held the coin that Ashwater's founding council had scraped together in 1815 to see the valley through its second winter, a sum that, converted and accounted for by Otis Fenwick with meticulous care, proved more than sufficient to retire the small debts still weighing on nearly a dozen Ashwater families, Ruth Calloway's own modest debt to the bank chief among them. Alden Marsh did not go to prison, and no mob dragged him from his bank, because Ruth would not have countenanced either outcome even had anyone proposed it. But the truth, once loosed into a town as small and interconnected as Ashwater Valley, did what truth generally does in such places: it traveled everywhere, was repeated at every supper table, and settled, slowly and permanently, over the Marsh family name a weight it had not carried before. The bank's board, several of whom had themselves been quietly squeezed by Alden's methods over the years, moved within the season to replace him as chief officer, and Alden Marsh spent the following years in Ashwater a diminished man, polite and careful and no longer trusted with anything he had not earned in full view of his neighbors. Silas Calloway, watching all of this unfold and understanding at last exactly what kind of man he had allowed himself to be used by, rode out to the waystation one gray afternoon that winter, hat in hand, and offered, without being asked, and without expecting forgiveness, to sign back over to Ruth the portion of the old ranch land the bank had since abandoned as worthless collateral, a small and imperfect restitution that Ruth accepted quietly, for Etta's sake more than her own. We began this story by telling you that Ruth Calloway was 44 years old and had nothing left to her name but a tin trunk, a thin shawl, and $11, and that she spent $4 of those dollars on a ruin nobody else wanted. We told you it was foolish. We told you it was desperate. What we did not tell you, not until now, is that the same patient eye her father had taught her at his forge, the eye that could not quite believe a broken, cheap, overlooked thing was truly worthless until it had been examined closely, turned over, given a fair chance to prove otherwise, was the very thing that let her see past 90 years of dust and doubt to the truth sitting quietly inside a sealed hearthstone. Ruth Calloway did not set out to become the woman who cleared a dead man's name or fed a hungry town's memory of itself. She set out only to survive a winter with a roof over her niece's head. But the valley she helped restore, and the man's grave she helped move inside its boundary at last, and the wheat that grew green from 90-year-old seed in her own garden plot the following spring, all trace back to the same simple, stubborn refusal that had defined her whole life, the refusal to declare a thing finished, or worthless, before she had truly looked at it. Thank you for spending this time with Ruth Calloway and the valley she helped make whole again. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it tonight, and we would love it if you left us a comment telling us this: what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? We read every one, and we treasure the stories you share with us as much as we treasure the ones we get to tell you. Until next time, stay close.